There's a particular kind of quiet that settles into an old garage on a sunny afternoon. It's a silence thick with the ghosts of past projects, the scent of old leather, motor oil, and time itself. For me, this garage has always been a sanctuary, more a museum of a life well lived than a simple place to park a car. It was my late husband Arthur's happy place, and since he's been gone, it has become mine. It's the one place I feel he is still truly with me. My name is Margaret Evans, but my grandson Leo just calls me Grams. To him, I am a sweet, slightly dotty old woman who makes a mean apple pie and doesn't quite understand how to use the internet. He sees me as a relic, a living piece of history to be treated with a kind of affectionate condescension. He has no idea that I was the one who balanced the books for Arthur's first engineering firm. He has no idea that I speak 3 languages. And he certainly has no idea what lies sleeping under the soft, worn cotton sheet in the corner of this garage. If you are listening to this, please consider subscribing. This is a story for anyone who has ever been lovingly underestimated. It's about a boy who thought he was borrowing a piece of junk, and a grandmother who knew he was about to learn a very, very expensive lesson about judging a book, or in this case, a car by its cover. I ran my hand over the dust sheet, feeling the familiar, elegant curves beneath the fabric. It was our secret, Arthur's and mine, his final masterpiece. After he retired, he spent the last 5 years of his life in this garage, not tinkering, but resurrecting. He poured his heart and his genius into this project, a final love letter to me, crafted in steel and chrome. The sound of a car door slamming and the crunch of gravel broke the afternoon quiet. A moment later, the garage door creaked open, flooding the space with bright light. It was Leo. At 19, he possessed all the unshakable, breathtaking confidence of a boy who has never been truly challenged. "Hey, Grams," he said, peering into the dim light. "Still hanging out with the ghosts in here?" He walked over, his trendy, ripped jeans and bright white sneakers looking alien in the old-world dust. He nodded towards the shrouded car. "You ever gonna get rid of this old rust bucket? Seriously, you could probably get a few grand for the scrap metal. Buy yourself a new television." I just smiled. "It has sentimental value, my dear." "Sentimental value doesn't get you from A to B," he scoffed, pulling out his phone and immediately becoming absorbed in it. This was our usual dynamic. Leo dispensing what he believed was profound, modern wisdom, and me, the gentle old woman, smiling and nodding, too old-fashioned to understand. It was the same way he'd tried to teach me how to use the new smartphone he'd bought me for Christmas. He had spoken to me in that slow, loud voice people use for small children and tourists. "See, Grams? You tap the icon. TAP. I just smiled and thanked him, not bothering to mention that I had built my own computer in the 1980 seconds and had been using a command line interface before he was even born. I found it was simpler and far more amusing to let him believe he was the expert. His underestimation was a comfortable cloak, and I had learned to wear it well. "So," he said, finally looking up from his phone, a new urgency in his voice. I need to ask you a favor." "Oh?" I said, turning to give him my full attention. "There's this girl," he began, a faint blush creeping up his neck. "Tiffany. She's amazing. And I kind of told her I could pick her up for our date tonight in a cool vintage car." He gestured vaguely at the shrouded form. "And I was thinking—" I raised an eyebrow. "You were thinking you would borrow this old rust bucket?" "Yeah," he said, his face lighting up, completely missing the sarcasm in my voice. "It would be perfect. It's so ironic. Retro. She'd love it. It would just be for a few hours. I'll be super careful." I felt a genuine laugh bubble up inside me, but I suppressed it, turning it into a gentle cough. "Oh, Leo," I said, shaking my head slowly. "I'm afraid that's impossible. It doesn't run very well, and I don't have the insurance sorted out. It's just not a good idea." The disappointment on his face was immediate and profound. "But Grams, you never use it. It just sits here. What's the point of having it?" "The point," I said, patting the dust sheet, "is the memories." He sighed, a dramatic, world-weary sound, and kicked at a loose stone on the garage floor. "Fine," he muttered. "Whatever. I'll figure something else out." He gave me a quick, distracted hug and left, the scent of his expensive cologne lingering in the air. I knew, of course, that this was not the end of it. I knew my grandson. His desire to impress a pretty girl was a force of nature far more powerful than his grandmother's gentle refusal. Later that evening, I made sure the old, brass key, a beautiful, heavy, intricate thing, so unlike modern car keys, was sitting in the small, ceramic bowl on the kitchen counter where we'd always kept our keys. It was a test, a final, simple test of his character. I then went to bed, leaving the back door unlocked, just as Arthur and I had always done in this safe, quiet town. The next morning, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The garage, which I could see from my bedroom window, was empty. The giant, sleeping form under the dust sheet was gone. I walked calmly down to the kitchen. The ceramic bowl was empty. The key was gone. In its place was a hastily scrawled note on a torn piece of napkin. I picked it up. The note read, "Grams, sorry, had a car emergency. Borrowed the rust bucket to take Tiffany out. Don't worry, I'll be careful. We'll try to have it back before it breaks down. Love ya, Leo." I read the note twice. Borrowed the rust bucket. Before it breaks down. He didn't even see it as a theft. He saw it as a joke, a harmless prank at the expense of his clueless old grandmother. The patronizing "love ya" was the final, perfect, insulting touch. I did not panic. I did not get angry. I did not call the police. I walked back to the garage and stood in the empty space where the car had been. I looked at the wall where a framed photograph of a young, handsome Arthur hung, his arm around my shoulders, both of us beaming. "Oh, Arthur," I said to the photograph, a slow, knowing smile spreading across my face. "Our boy is about to get the education of a lifetime." My lack of an immediate, frantic phone call was, I knew, the first part of Leo's education. He was expecting it. He was probably already rehearsing his excuses, his charmingly roguish apologies. My silence would be his first clue that the rules of the game he was playing were not what he thought they were. Instead of calling the police, I made myself a cup of tea and sat down in the sun-drenched breakfast nook that overlooked my garden. I thought about the car. Arthur had found it in a barn in rural France, a rusting, forgotten shell of a thing. He had spent years meticulously restoring it, not just to its former glory, but beyond. He had re-engineered the engine himself, reinforced the chassis, and lined the interior with the softest Italian leather, the same color as my eyes. To the untrained eye, it looked like a beautifully preserved but unremarkable old car. To a connoisseur, it was the Mona Lisa on 4 wheels. "It's a sleeper, Maggie," he had told me, his eyes twinkling after he'd finished. "It looks quiet, but it has the heart of a lion. A lot like you, my dear." He had only driven it once, on our 50th wedding anniversary. We had taken it down the coastal highway, the engine a low, powerful purr, the wind in our hair. It was a perfect day. After he passed, I had it carefully put away, the dust sheet a shroud over a perfect memory. I had never intended to drive it again, but Arthur, it seemed, had other plans. Meanwhile, miles away, Leo was embarking on his grand adventure. He had, as I later learned, pulled up to Tiffany's house with a flourish, the old car looking strangely magnificent in the morning sun. The deep, midnight blue paint, a custom mix Arthur had created, seemed to drink the light. Tiffany, a girl whose world was defined by the latest trends, was, to my surprise, genuinely impressed. "Oh my God, Leo," she had squealed, running a hand over the car's elegant fender. "It's so authentic. What is it?" "Just some old junk my grandma had lying around," Leo had replied with a casual, dismissive wave of his hand. A Ford, I think. She's so old and clueless, she doesn't even know what she has." The lie, so easily spoken, was the second part of his education. Pride goeth before a fall. He wasn't just stealing a car. He was stealing its story, its history, and claiming its coolness as his own, all while denigrating the woman it belonged to. They had spent the day driving around, turning heads wherever they went. Other drivers would slow down, trying to get a better look. Old men at gas stations would walk over, their eyes wide with a kind of holy reverence, asking questions Leo couldn't possibly answer. He just nodded and smiled, playing the part of the cool, mysterious owner of an enigmatic classic. He was having the time of his life, a king for a day in a stolen chariot. Their final destination was a scenic lookout point, a popular spot for teenagers to park and watch the sunset over the valley. It was here that Leo's education was scheduled to enter its third, and most important, phase. As they sat there, Tiffany admiring the view and Leo feeling like the most impressive 19-year-old on the planet, a police cruiser pulled up quietly behind them. I imagine the panic was immediate. A teenage boy in a borrowed car with a pretty girl at a notorious makeout spot. It was a classic recipe for a minor confrontation with the law. A police officer, a man with a kind, weathered face and a name tag that read Miller, strolled up to the driver's side window. "Good evening, son," Officer Miller said, his voice calm and professional. "Everything all right here?" "Yes, sir, officer," Leo said, trying to sound confident but failing miserably. "Just enjoying the view." "I see," Miller said, his eyes not on Leo, but on the car. I could almost hear the click in his brain, the sound of a lifelong passion suddenly being activated. He was a car guy. Of all the cops in all the towns in all the world, my grandson had been found by a car guy. "Arthur, you magnificent bastard," I thought, sipping my tea. "You couldn't have planned it better yourself." "You know, son," Officer Miller said, walking slowly around the car, running a hand gently over the trunk. "I pulled up because you have a busted tail light. But now that I'm here, I have to say, I am looking at one of the most beautiful automobiles I have ever seen in my 30 years on the force." Leo, seeing a chance to regain his coolness, puffed out his chest. "Thanks," he said. "It's a classic." "A classic doesn't even begin to cover it," Miller replied, his voice full of awe. "Mind if I ask what it is exactly?" And there it was, the question Leo couldn't answer. It's a Shelby," he stammered, remembering a name he'd once seen in a magazine. Officer Miller's eyes narrowed slightly. "A Shelby, you say? Interesting. License and registration, please, son." This was the part of the plan Leo had not thought through. He fumbled through the glove box, his hands suddenly sweaty. He pulled out the worn leather pouch that held the car's documents. He handed them to the officer. Officer Miller took the registration, and his friendly, car-loving demeanor vanished, replaced by a sharp, professional focus. He looked at the name on the registration, Margaret Evans. He looked at the name on Leo's driver's license, Leo Evans. "So, this is your grandmother's car?" he asked, his voice now holding a new, colder edge. "Yes, sir," Leo said quickly. "She lets me borrow it all the time." Another lie. A foolish, easily disproven lie. "I see," Miller said. "Well, you stay right here, son. I'm just going to run these plates." He walked back to his cruiser, and Leo was left to stew in a silence that was suddenly thick with a new, terrifying kind of dread. Tiffany was no longer looking impressed. She was looking nervous. Back in my kitchen, my phone finally rang. It was an unknown number. I let it ring 3 times for dramatic effect before answering. "Hello?" I said, my voice the perfect picture of a sweet, slightly confused old woman. "Ma'am," a deep, professional voice said on the other end. "This is Officer Miller with the County Sheriff's Department. I'm calling about a vehicle registered in your name, a 1966 Shelby." He paused, and I could hear the rustling of paper. I knew what was coming. I had been waiting for this moment all day. There was a long pause on the other end of the phone. I could hear the quiet crackle of Officer Miller's radio, the distant sound of passing traffic. I pictured him in his cruiser, staring at his computer screen, at the impossible string of words that had just flashed up next to my license plate number. He had pulled over a teenage joyrider and had stumbled into the automotive equivalent of a lost Da Vinci. "Ma'am," he said again, and his voice had now shifted from professional politeness to a tone of genuine, unadulterated awe. "Are you aware of what kind of vehicle you own?" I decided to play my part one last time. It was the final, crucial piece of Leo's education. He had to believe, for a few moments longer, that he was dealing with his clueless old grandmother. "Oh, you mean that old blue car in the garage?" I asked, my voice a carefully constructed quaver of grandmotherly innocence. "My husband, Arthur, used to tinker with it." He loved that old thing. I'm afraid I don't know much about cars myself, officer. Is there a problem? Did Leo run a red light? A problem, ma'am? He stammered, clearly trying to find the right words, to bridge the gap between my perceived ignorance and the incredible reality on his screen. I have your grandson, Leo, here with me. He was driving the vehicle. He told me it was just some old junk you had. Oh, that sounds like Leo, I said with a soft, forgiving chuckle, as if speaking of a mischievous but lovable toddler. He's a good boy, just a little headstrong. Did he get a ticket for the tail light? I do hope this won't be too expensive. This seemed to snap Officer Miller back to a state of professional focus. Ma'am, he said, his voice now firm and serious, the voice of a man delivering life-altering news. I need you to listen to me very carefully. The vehicle your grandson is currently in possession of is not junk. It is a 1966 Shelby Cobra 427 Super Snake. According to the International Registry of Classic Automobiles, there were only 2 of these ever made. The other one was destroyed in a racing accident in the 1960 seconds. This is the only one left. In the entire world. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in across the phone line. I remained silent, giving him the space to complete the revelation. Ma'am, he continued, his voice now hushed with reverence, we have its estimated auction value listed here at $5 million. I let out a small, perfectly timed gasp of feigned shock. It was a performance worthy of the stage. 5 million? I whispered, my voice trembling. Oh my goodness, I had no idea. Arthur always said it was special, but I never imagined. Ma'am, that's not all, he continued, his tone becoming grim. Because of its extreme rarity, this vehicle is also on a priority watch list for Interpol and the FBI's art crime team. When I ran the plates, it triggered an automatic, high-priority alert. We are legally obligated to treat this as a potential grand theft of a priceless cultural artifact. Your grandson is currently sitting in what is, for all intents and purposes, one of the most wanted cars on the planet, and he has no legal documentation, no insurance, and no believable story to prove he's allowed to be driving it. It was at that moment that I heard a new sound in the background of the call. It was the sound I had been waiting for all day. It was the sound of my grandson's carefully constructed world of teenage coolness shattering into a million terrified pieces. 5 million? FBI? Grandma, are you there? Tell him you let me borrow it. His voice was a high-pitched, cracking wail of pure, unadulterated panic. Officer, I said calmly, my voice steady, a stark contrast to my grandson's frantic cries. Is my grandson being detained? At the moment, ma'am, he is being investigated for grand theft auto. Given the value, this is a major felony. We're going to have to tow the vehicle to a secure impound lot to be verified by experts, and we'll need to bring your grandson down to the station for a formal questioning. I see, I said, letting a note of grandmotherly concern enter my voice. Well, that is very unfortunate. He was supposed to be on a date. I do hope his young lady friend has a way to get home. The beautiful, terrible perfection of that single practical statement was, I think, the moment the true horror of his situation finally dawned on my grandson. He wasn't just in trouble with the law. He was in trouble with a grandmother who was now discussing his date's transportation logistics while he was facing federal charges. I could hear him pleading, his voice a desperate, incoherent wail in the background, a symphony of consequences. The lesson was beginning. I could hear Officer Miller speaking to Leo in a low, firm voice in the background, trying to calm him down. My grandson's frantic, desperate energy was a stark contrast to the cold, quiet calm that had settled over my kitchen. I was not a participant in his chaos. I was an observer, a judge, perhaps. Grandma, please, I heard him wail again. You have to come down here. You have to explain it to them. Officer, I said, my voice full of a sweet, grandmotherly concern, a perfect performance of worried innocence. My grandson sounds very distressed. He's a good boy. Truly, just a bit impulsive. Perhaps you could put him on the phone for a moment? Maybe I can calm him down. There was a muffled exchange, a sigh from the officer, And then Leo's panicked, breathless voice was in my ear, tumbling out in a torrent of terror. Grams. "Oh my God, Grams, you have to help me. They think I stole the car. They're talking about the FBI and jail, and Tiffany is freaking out. She's crying. You have to tell them you let me borrow it." "Stole the car, dear?" I asked, my voice dripping with feigned confusion. "But your little note said you borrowed it. I thought that's what you kids did. Is there a difference?" The question, so simple, so naive, seemed to short-circuit his brain. He was expecting me to match his panic, to leap to his defense. He was not prepared for me to question the very premise of his actions. "They don't care about the note," he cried, his voice cracking. "They said it's worth $5 million. Is that really true, Grams? Is it?" The desperation in his voice was tinged with a new emotion, a flicker of greedy, avaricious hope. Even in his terror, he could still see the dollar signs. "It seems so," I replied calmly. "Your grandfather was a very talented man, a true artist. I'm glad his work is finally being appreciated." "Appreciated?" he shrieked. "Grams, they're about to tow it away and lock me up. You have to come down here right now and tell them you gave me permission." I paused. I let the silence stretch, letting him hang in the void of his own making. I pictured him there, on the side of the road, the flashing lights of the cruiser painting his terrified face in strobes of red and blue, the dream date with Tiffany curdling into a nightmare of public humiliation. It was a perfect, self-contained little ecosystem of consequences. "Well, dear," I finally said, my voice thoughtful and deliberate. "That's the funny thing about permission. It's a rather legal concept, you see." "What are you talking about?" he demanded. "I'm talking about liability, Leo," I replied, my tone shifting slightly, losing some of its soft, grandmotherly fluff, becoming sharper, more precise. "If I come down there and officially state that I, the legal owner, gave you permission to drive a $5 million, uninsured, one-of-a-kind vehicle, then I become legally and financially liable for any and all damages. And since Officer Miller has already noted that you have a broken taillight, well, I imagine repairing a car like that is quite expensive. It seems impractical." He was silent for a moment, his mind clearly struggling to keep up. He had expected an emotional response, and I had given him a cold, hard lesson in tort law. "Impractical?" he finally squeaked, the word an insult to his own desperate reality. "I could go to jail and you're talking about what's impractical?" "Actions have consequences, Leo," I said, and now all pretense of the sweet old woman was gone from my voice. It was cold, hard, and as clear as glass. "You called me old and clueless. You saw the most treasured memory I have of your grandfather as a rust bucket to be used as a cheap prop to impress a girl. You did not ask, you took. You did not borrow, you stole. Not just a car, but a piece of my heart. And now you are experiencing the consequences." He was openly sobbing now, the raw, ugly sound of a spoiled child finally facing a boundary he could not charm his way past. "Please, Grandma," he wept. "I'm sorry. I really am. I'm so sorry. I'll do anything." "I'm sure you are," I said, my voice softening just a little. Not with pity, but with a profound, weary sadness. "You will be picked up from the station in the morning by your father. I will call him in a few minutes. In the meantime, I suggest you think very carefully about the difference between value and price. Your grandfather's car has a price. My trust in you, however, had a value, and you have destroyed it. Goodbye, Leo." I hung up the phone before he could reply. I placed the receiver gently back in its cradle. The silence in my kitchen returned, but it was different now. It was no longer a silence of waiting. It was the silence of a lesson delivered, of a chapter closed. The trap had been sprung. The consequences were in motion. And my grandson was finally, for the first time in his life, completely and utterly on his own. I stood in my quiet kitchen for a long time after the call, the receiver cool against my palm. The silence in the house was a heavy blanket, no longer peaceful, but charged with the aftermath of the storm I had unleashed. I did not feel the triumphant, fist-pumping thrill I had perhaps expected. There was no joy in my grandson's terror, no satisfaction in his tears. There was only a deep, profound, and weary sadness. The lesson had been delivered, but the cost was high. I had been forced to use the cold, impersonal machinery of the law as a wall between myself and my own family. And I knew, with a certainty that ached in my bones, that some things, once broken, could never be put back together in quite the same way. I made the call to my son, a conversation that was one of the most difficult of my life. It was brief, painful, and brutally necessary. I explained the situation in calm, factual terms: the theft, the police, the car's true, staggering value, the potential felony charges. I did not embellish, I did not accuse. I simply presented the facts, like a doctor delivering a grim diagnosis. He was, by turns, disbelieving, horrified, and then, as the reality sank in, deeply and profoundly ashamed. To his credit, he did not make excuses for Leo. He just listened, and in his long, heavy silences, I could hear the unmistakable sound of a father's heart breaking. The next morning arrived with a gray, unforgiving light. A car I didn't recognize pulled into the driveway. My son, his face etched with a sleepless exhaustion, got out and opened the passenger door. Leo emerged. He looked like a ghost. His usual arrogant swagger, the confident slump of his shoulders, was completely gone. He looked smaller, humbled, a boy again instead of the posturing young man he had been just 24 hours before. He walked into my kitchen and stood before me by the table, his head bowed, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He couldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at a spot on my clean linoleum floor. Tiffany, I had learned from my son, had been picked up by her furious father the night before and had blocked Leo's number, the first, and perhaps most immediate, consequence. "Grandma," he whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. It was a sound I had not heard since he was a small boy, crying over a scraped knee. "I am so sorry, for everything, for the car, for calling you, for what I said, for everything." I just nodded, my hands steady as I poured him a cup of tea I had prepared. I pushed the cup, warm and fragrant, across the table towards him. Words were not needed in that moment. His humiliation, his fear, his newfound and brutal understanding of the world, it was all there in his bowed head. The lesson was complete. He had not just learned that his grandmother's car was valuable, he had learned that his grandmother was valuable, and that was a lesson worth far more than $5 million. A few weeks later, after a series of legal wranglings that involved my quiet intervention, a very expensive apology from my son to the county, and a mandatory community service sentence for Leo at a local classic car museum, the car was returned. It did not arrive under its own power. It was delivered on a pristine, black, flatbed truck, handled by two men in white gloves, with the kind of reverence usually reserved for visiting royalty. It now sits back in the garage, under its soft cotton sheet. It is not just a memory anymore. It is a monument to a brilliant man's love, and to a hard-learned lesson in respect. Leo is different now. The change is not loud or dramatic. It is quiet and profound. The arrogance has been replaced by a new, hesitant respect. He visits me every week, not out of obligation, but because, I think, he is genuinely trying to understand. He no longer tries to teach me how to use my phone. Instead, he asks me questions. The other day, he was helping me in the garden, his hands, usually glued to a screen, now covered in dirt. He paused, leaning on his shovel, and looked at the house. "Why didn't you ever tell us about the car, Grams?" he asked, his voice quiet. "About what it really was?" I smiled, patting the soil around a young tomato plant. "Because, my dear, your grandfather didn't build it to be a price tag. He built it to be a piece of art. Its value wasn't in the money it was worth, but in the love he put into it. That's a different kind of value, one you can't understand until you're ready." He was silent for a long time, just looking at the garden. "I think," he said finally, "I'm starting to understand. Our relationship is not what it was. It is quieter, more honest, and in its own way, stronger. He no longer sees a clueless old woman, he sees me. And I, in turn, am beginning to see the man his grandfather always hoped he would become. A man who understands that the most valuable things in our lives, trust, respect, love, are the things that are most easily broken and the hardest to repair. Sometimes, it takes a $5 million car to remind a young man of the priceless value of his own grandmother. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your own story in the comments. Your voice, believe me, always matters.